Good morning, everyone. Today is April 13th, 2023, and welcome to the New Possibilities Hour, part of the Will Work for Food project, founded by Natalie Armstrong Motan in the spring of 2020. Every Thursday morning, Jean Lawler and I are delighted to host another cutting-edge webinar for mediators, arbitrators, lawyers, and everybody who negotiates. As you know, there's no charge for these great webinars. Rather, we ask people to contribute whatever amount they're comfortable contributing to a food bank, either one proposed by our speaker or one of their choice in their own community. And one of my favorite parts of the webinar every week is when we announce the running total of just how much our generous audiences have contributed in honor of our great speakers. Jean Lawler, would you please do the honors?
With pleasure. Well, we're getting really close to that $400,000 mark, Jeff and Natalie and everyone. So thank you so much. The number that we know of today for donations people have told us about that they've made to food banks around the globe is $382,218.92 in US. And, you know, that's give or take about 4 million meals. That's just amazing. So thank you all.
Thank you all very much. We are delighted that for the first time, we have someone with the rank of ambassador and cabinet member as our presenter here on the New Possibilities Hour, and that's Robert C. O'Brien. Robert C. O'Brien is co-founder and chairman of American Global Strategies, LLC. He was the 27th United States National Security Advisor from 2019 to 2021. Robert O'Brien served as the President's principal advisor on all aspects of American foreign policy and national security affairs. During Ambassador O'Brien's time as National Security Advisor, the United States orchestrated the historic Abraham Accords in the Middle East, brokered economic normalization between Serbia and Kosovo, achieved significant defense spending increases among our NATO allies, and increased cooperation with America's allies across the Indo-Pacific. Before serving as National Security Advisor, O'Brien was the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs with the personal rank of Ambassador. He was directly involved in the return of over 25 detainees and hostages to the United States. He previously served as co-chair of the United States Department of State Public-Private Partnership for Justice Reform in Afghanistan, under both Secretaries of State Rice and Clinton. O'Brien was also a presidentially appointed member of the U.S. Cultural Property Advisory Committee from 2008 to 2011. In 2005, O'Brien was nominated by President George W. Bush and unanimously confirmed by the United States Senate to serve as a U.S. representative to the 60th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Earlier in his career, O'Brien served as a senior legal officer for the UN Security Council Commission that decided claims against Iraq arising out of the first Gulf War. He was a major in the Judge Advocate General's Corps of the U.S. Army Reserve. Robert O'Brien is the recipient of the National Security Medal, the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal, the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service, the National Defense Medal, the Légion d'honneur Chevalier, that I believe was presented by President Macron in France, and the Kosovo Presidential Medal of Merits. O'Brien holds a JD from UC Berkeley School of Law. He received a bachelor's degree in political science, cum laude, from UCLA right here in Los Angeles. Robert, we are so delighted to have you here to talk about negotiation lessons from diplomacy. Please tell us a little bit about whatever food bank you'd like people, wherever you'd like people to contribute if they are able. And then we're very eager to learn from you. My friend, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jeff. And what an honor it is to be here with you this morning. It's been a busy morning already. This is the third engagement I've had. I just got off a World Trade Center in Utah speech with a panel with Secretary Pompeo and talking about China. And so this is a little bit different. And I know we've got a lot of mediators and negotiators and professionals who are excellent in their field. And so I want to kind of take a different approach to just talk about, what it means to get a deal done. And I think my training as a lawyer in Los Angeles, I kind of got a little bit of a hard time when I became the national security advisor. There were some headlines that said Trump picks LA entertainment lawyer to be the national security advisor. And there was some truth to that. I've represented some of the big entertainment companies, but I had a long career in government as well, as Jeff pointed out in his very generous introduction. But again, those negotiations were it helped me tremendously in both as a hostage envoy and as the national security advisor in getting deals done. And I used to tell people that I can pick 20 lawyers in LA that could do a better job negotiating some of our deals internationally for the government than some of the best folks at the State Department. So, and again, that's not a rap on the State Department, but anyone who's done a mediation or try to settle a case in LA federal court or LA Superior Court knows what I'm talking about. So I'm not going to tell you a lot you don't know. Maybe what the best thing to do is to talk a little bit about just kind of one case study, the Abraham Accords, and then open it up to questions and answers. And before I do that, on the food bank, a number of great food banks. I'll let you, Jeff, talk to Jeff, get his recommendation. Obviously, Union Station is well known in Pasadena and Los Angeles, but look, whatever charitable contribution you can make to whatever organization that you already support would be well received. And I'm grateful for your generosity of your time and talents with charity here in LA. We're very blessed and very fortunate, and there are a lot of our brothers and sisters around the city that we see every day and we walk past every day that don't have the same blessings that we enjoy. And so anything you can do to help alleviate their suffering and their misery and help get them back on their feet is commendable, and give it to the charities of your choice. And thank you for for sharing. So, when I became the hostage envoy, I hadn't been on Donald Trump's team. I had never met Donald Trump. I'd only seen him at the presidential debates. I had been with another candidate, Scott Walker, governor of Wisconsin, former governor of Wisconsin, which fit a pattern. I picked losing presidential candidates for many years. I was the senior advisor to Governor Romney on his two campaigns, and Scott Walker. And so if you ever see me go with a presidential campaign, you should short it, because that's probably the high water mark of the campaign. It's only going south from there. But I got a call shortly into the Trump administration and asked to do this hostage job. And I knew some of the cases of the hostages that were overseas. And I thought, well, I'll do it part-time for a year or two and see who I can get home. And one thing led to another. I ended up as national security advisor. What I didn't realize in the Trump administration is that most of the work I'd be doing, or the most important work I'd be doing, was for peace. And some of the things that we got done, we got a Serbia-Kosovo deal done for economic normalization. We healed the Gulf Rift between, or at least resolved the embargo from the Saudis, UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt on Qatar. We got a deal in Afghanistan that, unfortunately, the withdrawal from Afghanistan did not end the way that we'd hoped, but we got a deal with the Taliban. And so and then of course the most important thing, and I think a legacy of the Trump administration, even for people that don't like President Trump or don't approve of him, are the Abraham Accords. And it's I think 50 years from now, when some of the partisan rancor that we're experiencing in our country today, which is unfortunate, and on both sides, dissipates, people are going to look back at the Abraham Accords as being a signal accomplishment of the United States of America, not just of the Trump administration, but of us as a country seeking peace in the Middle East. And I spent a lot of time in Israel, a lot of time in the Gulf states working on that deal. And people ask how we got it done. And keep in mind, it was a relatively signal accomplishment, because up until the Abraham Accords, Israel had only done 2 peace deals, one with Jordan and one with Egypt. And they were both more security deals than peace deals. They weren't warm deals. They'd both gone somewhat cold. And with the Abraham Accords, we got the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, and even Kosovo, a Muslim majority country in Europe, to all sign, in the case of Sudan, a peace deal, in the case of Morocco, a resumption of diplomatic relations, and in the case of the other countries, a diplomatic normalization between them and Israel. And, it wasn't easy, but the way we got there is we thought outside the box. And it started before I arrived with Jared Kushner and David Friedman, our ambassador to Israel, kind of thinking, how do we get past the roadblock of the Palestinian question? Because up until the time of the Abraham Accords, everyone thought the only way to Middle East peace was through the Palestinians. But unfortunately, the Palestinians just weren't interested in doing a deal. And I remember when I became the national security advisor, I met with Henry Kissinger, and he said, and Secretary Kissinger is just 99, is amazing, is 100% there still. Said, listen, you're never going to get the Palestinians to do a deal. They never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And President Clinton came very close to getting Yasser Arafat at Camp David to do a deal, but it fell through at the last minute. The Palestinians just couldn't pull the trigger. So we gave the Palestinians what we thought was a very good proposal to start negotiations that would have made the Palestinian state a very wealthy state. We had financial commitments and that sort of thing. And our Arab allies and partners saw that it was a fair deal and that we were putting a lot on the table for the Palestinians. And in typical fashion, they walked away from it. So we decided we're going to go outside the Palestinians and see if we can work deals directly with our Arab neighbors and Israel's Arab neighbors and our Arab partners in the Gulf, and see if we can get something done. And it wasn't easy. We had to build political capital on both sides. And I think this has some implications for mediation and negotiation in outside of the diplomatic world. We moved our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and that created a lot of political capital in Israel. And I'll talk about how we spent that later. We recognized the Golan Heights in Israel as being Israeli property and Israel having sovereignty over the Golan. With the UAE, they were very concerned about Iran. And so we put maximum pressure on Iran, and we got the UAE some of the weapon systems. And that first started out with a relationship I developed with Mohammed bin Zayed, MBZ, the now president, then crown prince of the UAE, when I was a hostage envoy, and he was helping us get a particular hostage out of Yemen. And so we built that political capital. The other thing we had to do was figure out what kind of tools do we have in this negotiation. And when we think of it as lawyers, we're usually settling a case. It's usually monetary, but there are non-monetary tools. And so we kind of looked at the relationships between these countries and said, what can we do to make what tools can we use to make it interesting to settle the case or to get the deal that aren't necessarily geopolitics or land for peace or the big things that you normally think about in these cases. And one of the things we identified was tourism. Israelis wanted to be able to go to the UAE, to Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Bahrain and travel in the region. And El Al wanted to fly, and people wanted to be recognized for who they were and not be discriminated against and not be allowed to enter a country because of either because of their religious faith as Jews or because of their citizenship as Israelis. But we also realized that there were Arabs that were interested in going to visit the third most holy site in Islam, which is the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock up on the Temple Mount. And so we rolled that out as a opportunity for Arabs and devout Muslims to do pilgrimages to Jerusalem and a way to get Israelis to go do tourism to the Gulf. We looked at investment opportunities. One of the things that we saw with the increased CFIUS activity that we'd had on Chinese investment in American tech, the Chinese had started going to Israel. And in case you haven't been there recently, the tech industry in Israel, it's off the charts. It's the second Silicon Valley. I mean, almost everything you use tech-wise, there's some Israeli component to it, either on the software, the hardware part. And they're very entrepreneurial. These Israeli young people come out of the Israeli army, especially the certain unit that does cyber and other technology work that's relatively advanced, and they come out of the army and they start companies, but they need seed capital. And so we saw the Chinese, as it was getting harder for the Chinese to invest here, the Chinese were trying to backdoor into the tech sector in Israel. Now, Israel is a little uncomfortable with that, but entrepreneurs need money to start their companies. We also realized, though, that the Arab nations, especially the UAE, had massive amounts of investment capital in their sovereign wealth funds. I mean, the sovereign wealth funds just keep getting bigger every day as the oil comes out of the ground, and they have to place that money. And so we thought, why don't we get the UAE and these Arab countries to invest in Israeli tech? It'd be good for everybody. Big returns for the Arabs and help solidify Abu Dhabi and Dubai as financial capitals in the region, and get non-Chinese money to the Israelis and give them the money to continue to build their tech industry and do it all in the neighborhood. And then the third part of it was just the politics of the deal in the various countries to create peacemakers out of world leaders and make people statesmen. And so those were some of the tools we had. But there were things we had to overcome, and there were obstacles, of course. It wasn't as easy as just sitting down and, as an American, looking at the situation, saying, "Hey, this makes sense." And we had to figure out how we turn those obstacles into opportunities. And again, I think that's something we face in our cases. If we're trying to settle a case or get a deal done, things are going to come up that you don't expect. So, kind of in the middle of we were making a lot of progress in the middle of the negotiations. I had gone home from the White House, got into my pajamas, was ready to go to bed at about 10 p.m. And we were going to have a meeting early the next morning with Bibi Netanyahu. The prime minister had come over to Washington for a meeting with the president. And I got a call. It was probably 11 o'clock, and it was Jared Kushner. And Jared said, "Hey, are you in bed yet?" And I kind of said, "Oh, no, I'm not in bed. I think, it's just about to fall asleep." He said, "Great, come back over to Blair House," which is a government guest house across the street from the White House, across Pennsylvania Avenue, where we put up visiting heads of government and sometimes former presidents. And I said, "Really, we're going to see Bibi in the morning?" He goes, "No, Bibi wants to meet now." And I said, it's Bibi Netanyahu. You can't really say no. And so I put on a suit and left my tie off, because Bibi never wore a tie unless it was a formal event, and shot over to Blair House. And we realized we had a problem, because the prime minister was involved in a very tough re-election campaign at the time. He wanted to extend basically annex parts of the West Bank. The Israelis call it extending Israeli sovereignty over, de facto settlements and cities in the West Bank. It would have killed the peace negotiations with the Arabs. And so we realized, that it also gave us a bargaining chip with the Arabs. And we went to the UAE and said, "Look, if we can get the Israelis not to do this, and you call for it, this would be something to make peace on. If you stop this from happening, it would show your solidarity with the Palestinian people, and would give you a reason to enter into to finalize the negotiations. But we've got to work hard with Bibi." And so I sat down with the prime minister, and we had David Friedman was there, and Jared Kushner was there. And I've told this story before, and it's been told in Jared's book. And what actually happened is Jared said, "Robert, tell the prime minister that he can't annex the West Bank." And I'm sitting across from a guy who's a lion of the history, someone who's kind of the Winston Churchill in many people's view of the Middle East, and person who had been prime minister of Israel for 12 years and was 20 years my senior. And I had to tell him, "Mr. Prime Minister, I know this is the annexation would be good for you politically, and I know you've got a close election, but this is an opportunity for peace, and you can't walk away from it. And if you do, if the annexation goes forward, the United States is going to have to tell the world that you were this was the time that Israel walked away from the peace table. It wasn't the Palestinians, it wasn't the Arabs, but that you're walking away from peace." And that was one of the tougher conversations I had in my entire career in government. And having Bibi fix a hard stare on me across the table, and I stared back at him. I think he realized we were serious, and he knew my boss at the time, President Trump, would do something like that. But we built the capital with him to make the ask. We weren't making the ask in a vacuum. We were making the ask as friends who'd taken a risk and moved our embassy to Jerusalem, and who'd done the goal-on deal. It was our time to spend that political capital, which many politicians don't want to do. And Bibi made the tough call. And that's what led to the Abraham Accords being finalized and getting signed. And I think it was September 15th of 2020 when we did the signing on the lawn of the South Lawn of the White House. But it took a lot of courage for Bibi to do that. But again, we took a bad situation with the annexation and turned it into an opportunity. And I think that's something we have to be ready to do as mediators, is to kind of look at roadblocks and figure out, how do we turn a roadblock into a way to get a case settled, and how do we look at it creatively? So just kind of in summary, look at the tools that you've got when you're looking at a case. Think outside the box, not just monetary tools, but in legal cases, there injunctive relief, or there are apologies, or there are changes in policy, or there are PR messages, or there are charitable contributions. I mean, look at the whole gamut of things that can be used potentially in a case to settle a case. And that's just what we did with the Abraham Accords. When And then once you develop your credibility and you've developed a rapport with the parties, sometimes you're gonna have to make, and I know you all do this, you're gonna have to make the hard ask of the parties and get them to do things and ask them to do things that they really, really don't want to do, but are necessary if they're gonna have a resolution of the case short of going to court and going to trial and having all the risk attendant there too. And then be flexible when a roadblock shows up. Don't throw your hands up and say, okay, that was the end of it. We were so close and we got this far and we're going to go no further. Figure out how to climb over the roadblock or drive around the roadblock or, if necessary, plow through the roadblock. But try and turn that into an opportunity and use some flexibility to see if there's a way to settle around the situation. So, I think it's always more interesting in these circumstances to answer your questions and to have a conversation than just hear me, give my view of the world. So those are some thoughts on how we got to a peace deal that has turned out to be durable. I'll just end with this point. There's nothing I like seeing more than, I'm not normally on Instagram, but my daughters will show me a bat mitzvah or bar mitzvah that's taking place in Dubai. And I was on the first flight to Abu Dhabi with the first scheduled El Al flight from Ben Gurion Airport to Abu Dhabi. We were flying with some Israeli officials, and just to talk about what peace means, putting aside the economics of it, putting aside the geopolitics of it, just is what it means for people to resolve a conflict. As we flew over Saudi Arabia, we were on an old 737 in the El Al fleet and had the cameras up in front, or the maps up in front on screens. They were on our chairs, and it showed we were going into Saudi Arabia. And the captain of the flight got on the intercom and said first in Hebrew and then in English that we're now in Saudi airspace. And I looked over, and the Israeli National Security Advisor, Meir Ben Shabbat, who was looked like your friend's rabbi, older guy, and yarmulke, wore a kippah, and a very sweet man, but he was a killer. He'd been the number 2 guy at Shin Bet, so he'd tough guy, but he looked like a sweet old guy. He started crying. And a bunch of these tough Israeli security officials were choked up about flying over Saudi airspace. And I've got a kind of bad sense of humor, and so I hopped up out of my seat, and Jared and I were in seats 1 and 2 on I think Alpha and Bravo on the left side, and they were on 1, Charlie and Delta next to us. I hopped up and I walked over and I leaned down and I said, "Hey, guys, let's face it, this isn't the first time an Israeli jet's flown over Saudi airspace. Don't get so emotional about it." And Meir Ben Shabbat looked at me and he said, "Yes, Robert," in his gravelly voice, "but it's the first time we've been invited." And I've never forgotten him saying that, and what that meant, and what peace means, and the fact that the accords have been durable. That the Biden administration, to their credit, have done a great job in trying to extend the accords and deepen the accords. That the Abraham Accord name has stayed in place, and that the parties themselves are committed to it. Is something that's that I feel proud of having played a small part in the negotiations. I feel proud of, but I feel more proud as an American that America had a role, not Trump, not Biden, not any political party, but our country had a role in brokering peace in a tough neighborhood in a difficult part of the world, but that we brought some peace and happiness to the lives of the people that live there. So with that, I'll turn things over to you, Jeff, and open up to questions, and hopefully I'll have some answers for you.
Thank you, Robert. That was fantastic. So much there, so many questions to ask. Let me ask what may seem like a mundane question. You talked about talking tough to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and that you had spent a considerable amount of time building and developing trust and confidence and the relationship with him that allowed you to talk tough and break some bad news to him. In regular old commercial mediations, we oftentimes don't have long histories of relationships with people. We may know the lawyers, but the clients, many times, we've just met that morning. And yet, we're still expected sometimes to talk tough to those people. What are some of the things that we might do in a matter of hours to develop that kind of trust and confidence when we're called upon to do the task and we don't have months or years to do it?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeff. And look, it happens in diplomacy as well. You get shuttled off to some country and you have to learn about it quickly and get briefed and get up to speed. I'd make two comments. Number one, especially in a commercial arbitration or a civil case, really read the papers and understand the positions of the parties. Because if you come in for the mediators, even if you're doing an opening session with both parties, or you're going to do a one-on-one with each side, when you show that you know the case, that you didn't just flip through the mediation brief that morning, and you actually know who the parties are, you know what the issues are, you know the strengths and weaknesses of the case. Parties, not just the lawyers, but the parties innately understand that you put the time in and that you care about them and you care about the job that you're doing. I can't emphasize that enough. And I've been on both sides. I've mediated a lot of cases, and I've been a discovery master and a special master in dozens of cases, an arbitrator. But I've also been on the other side of it more often than I've been on the neutral side as counsel. And you really know the mediators and the neutrals that have dug in and understand your case, and you respect the fact that they've put the effort in. So I think that's a way that you develop credibility right out of the bat, right out of the chute. And the other thing that you can do off the bat is ask the parties, not just the lawyers, because the lawyers are always going to give a polished presentation. I mean, we've got great lawyers, and especially in Los Angeles, I think we've got the best litigators in the country here. But we ask the parties what they think and what's important to them. And it's hard to do that in a joint session, but in the first one-on-one session, ask obviously the aggrieved party, that both parties are always aggrieved. The defendant always feels like they've been wrongly sued, and it's a terrible thing that's happened to them, and how can they do business in this environment? And the plaintiff's been aggrieved because of some, tort or breach of contract that's occurred to them. Ask them how they feel, and ask them to tell you their story without the legal jargon, without the lawyer intervening, so you can get a feel for give them their day in court. And it's amazing how cathartic it is for people, even if it's just a 10 or 15-minute presentation, to tell you, a neutral person, because the odds are, as we all know, they're not getting to trial. I mean, especially if it's in LA County, the odds of going to a jury trial or a bench trial, even in arbitration, are pretty long, and they want to tell their story, especially on the plaintiff side, on the quote victim side. And so let them tell their story. And that alone, that having their day in court and being able to talk to a respected neutral, a respected mediator that both sides had enough confidence in to select, is going to give that person a lot of faith and confidence in you if you and truly listen. Don't. And I don't need to tell this group this, because we've got a bunch of accomplished people on the conference call, but don't check even if your phone's buzzing, don't check your phone. Don't take notes. Make eye contact and try and listen and understand what the person's telling you, and they'll understand. They'll sense the sincerity, and that'll also help build up a lot of credibility. But those are the two things I'd say to do right off the bat that you can do in a compressed period of time, where you don't have a long time to develop that kind of track record.
That makes as much sense here in Los Angeles as it does all over the country. We have people on the Zoom this morning, Robert, from all over the country. As much sense as it does in international negotiations as well. Now let's go to the other end of the negotiation, the end. You mentioned when negotiating with the Palestinians that there was kind of an impasse there, and you had to turn away from them and engage in negotiations with other partners, the Gulf states. Declaring an impasse and quote unquote giving up is very difficult in the private negotiations we do, and it must be even more terribly frustrating in the international negotiations that you do. Tell us about the circumstances where you do declare an impasse. What leads you to do it? What are some of the, since we're talking about Middle Eastern and religions, what are some of the false idols of impasse, things that might lead you to declare an impasse, but which really shouldn't? And address how to deal with those frustrations.
Yeah, so there's always baggage in history that comes with the negotiation, whether you're doing it, whether it's commercial arbitration or commercial mediation or a commercial dispute or an international dispute. But the international disputes can come with hundreds of years of history. So I think of Serbia and Kosovo, where the grievances on both sides are long and heartfelt, and have been passed on from grandfather to grandson, We've got Serbs who are still talking about the Ottoman occupation and the destruction of churches. You got, the Kosovars who are talking about, they're being abused as a minority in their own country and not being able to speak their language and having their religion, their Islamic faith, trampled on by the majority Serbian Orthodox community and being ruled by a small group of people and almost what they would describe as an apartheid state. So both sides had lots of grievances and you talk to them and all of a sudden battles, and I'm a fairly decent student of history, but they'd start talking about some battle in 1693, and some city you've never heard of in the Balkans, where the Ottomans created, engaged in some terrible atrocity against the Serbs or the Christians, or the Ottomans would have some story 100 years later of the slaughter, and these things are long held, and so it's even more deeply felt, in those negotiations than in a commercial, as bad as a tort might be, as a sexual harassment or sexual discrimination or a employment dispute or a nasty breach of contract or an interference with contract claim, or whatever it is here. They can be particularly nasty and deep seated, and so you have to figure out ways to get around. If you want to avoid impasses, you got to figure out ways to move past that. So the best way is to think outside the box and to not get dragged into relitigating the history of the Ottoman Empire and the Balkans and then how the Serbians how the Christians responded to it, but to start talking about what everyone cares about. And that's people. What I found is whether it's in China and whether it's in the Middle East or Latin America, I think of doing hostage cases all over the world. In addition to my time as national security advisor, people are worried about their kids. They want their kids to have a great future. They want their kids to be able to get a good job. They want their kids to be educated. And when you change the focus from the past to the future, that's a way to avoid some of these impacts and start talking about everyone. People love to talk about their kids. People love to talk about their grandkids. That's true in what we do as litigators and as neutrals in cases in America. That's as true for doing international negotiations. So if you can try and reframe it about what kind of world your son or your daughter or your grandchild is going to live in, that's a way to avoid the impasse. But some of these impasses you're not going to be able to get over. So you got to try and the way that I'd figure out how to get over an impasse is to take the very best deal I could think of, like in a best case scenario. And we did this with the Palestinians. We got so much aid lined up from the Gulf states and from America that, like literally every Palestinian in the West Bank and Gaza may not have been a millionaire, but they would have done extraordinarily well. I mean, their lifestyle would have been dramatically altered. The money would have just flown into those places, and we could have maybe even turned them into like free trade areas and the new Hong Kongs of the Middle East. And the Palestinians are smart. I mean, they're well educated, and it was a real opportunity for them. And we gave them such a good deal that we knew if they walked away from that it was about more than a future for their kids and their grandkids. It was about hatred of Israel, hatred of Jews, that their solution was going to be to push Israel into the sea, that there wasn't going to be a two-state solution. We drew a map that was very good to them. And when they walked away from that, we thought, we realized, hey, we gave these guys a heck of a deal. Like, this is a deal you should have taken them. Abbas should have taken the deal and ran like a bandit. And, like he was getting a stolen car. He should have driven it as fast as he could and gotten out of there. And when they turned that down, we knew it wasn't going to happen. But I think that's one way you can figure out if maybe you don't even have authorization from the counterparty to give that good of a deal. But if you sat down with a party that was recalcitrant or reticent and said, I'm not saying I can get you this, but if I could get you a deal that looked like this, and whatever this is, you have X, fill in the blank, and you sketch out something that you as a mediator know it would be a great deal, that you might not even be able to get from the other side. And if they're still not willing to take that, at that point you realize, okay, we got an impasse here, and we got to figure out how to, this may be one of those few cases that has to go to trial, or has to go to arbitration, because their emotions or history so tied up in it that they're not going to settle, even under the very best of circumstances, even under stupid circumstances. But but you really have to try and test it out before you walk away, because otherwise you're gonna leave potential deals on the table, because folks are hard negotiators. I mean, you know, I did arms control with the Russians. I mean, they were brutal. You know, Mike Pompeo and I were talking about this in a different context earlier today on another panel. You know, the South Koreans are, you know, maybe the best negotiators out there. Those guys are killers. And so, you know, you especially internationally, you run into people that have been negotiating a lot, you know, for a lot longer than we've been a country. And that's certainly the case in the Middle East. So before you declare an impasse, you need to make sure that that it's a real impasse before you're willing to give up on things. And otherwise, it's too easy to give up on it. Either in what we do day to day as lawyers or as diplomats. But but you are going to run into those cases where you kind of have to tell the parties, yeah, you're going to trial, because if you're not willing to take X, which would be a home run for you, or it'd be a great deal for you, then you've got to do something else. Sometimes it's a lawyer, sometimes it's a client, sometimes it's both. But you know, you'll get a sense of that, and I'm sure you know everyone on the panel, everyone on the call today has seen those circumstances arise.
Robert, what makes the South Koreans such great negotiators, and what can we learn from them?
They're just tough. I mean, it's you try and get give and take going in negotiations, and you know, we've all seen this in commercial cases. They'll stare you down, and they won't budge. They won't give an inch well into the negotiations. Now, eventually, you're going to get a deal done, but they'll extend it to the very end and really take a hard line and demand. You know, with South Korea, it was always in the trade sphere, or I'd mediated kind of between them and the Japanese, which was not easy. One of my first things as national security advisor, I brought in the Japanese national security advisor and the South Korean national security advisor. And you would think this long after the war that some of those wounds would be healed, but they're still pretty fresh between those two countries. And I knew things had gone bad because we had interpreters. Koreans were speaking Korean, the Japanese were speaking Japanese. I had no facility in either language, and but I did understand the word comfort women would show up from time to time in the middle of a burst of Korean, and I knew it wasn't going well when comfort women popped up and didn't need translation. So that was. But look, they take a hard line till the very end, and they don't move until they absolutely have to. And we see that in some cases in our cases that we handle here. And the question is, what can you do to get to the point where they actually, how do you get to the point where they're going to move and not outweight you? And we've seen that where it's 2 a.m. when we've been meeting a case since 9 a.m, and finally at 2 o'clock in the morning there's some movement, and you don't want to leave because you're afraid it'll start again the next morning back at 0. And so you just got to plow through, and sometimes it just takes perseverance to get through it and get the parties actually to start talking about what's important. But the reality is they wouldn't be there if they didn't want a deal, and you've got to use what leverage you can. And but sometimes you're gonna have to just sit through a lot of a lot of tough talk or a lot of silence to get to the point where a party's willing to move.
So under what circumstances are you an advocate of that kind of hard bargaining?
It's kind of Churchill when he spoke to the boys at Harrow. I think it was at the boys' school in 1941. Kind of the height of the war. Things didn't look good for the UK, and he said it was his never give up speech. In matters large or small, in which, but he says, unless, I'm paraphrasing, unless you realize you're wrong, and then you gotta, that might be a reason to change your position. But, if there's an important principle at stake that a remedy that you're trying to get that will right a wrong, racial discrimination aspect to a case that, just has to be fixed at a company, or a sexual discrimination case, situation. There are times when a plaintiff has to, when money really isn't enough, or money may not be the primary motivating factor. And in that case, if you're on the plaintiff side, you need to hold out to try and remedy the wrong. On the other hand, on the defense side, there are gonna be times when a company is being held up. And giving in here in this case would result in having to give in a number of other cases, and could potentially affect the viability of the company. and there's a matter of principle of keeping the company in business and keeping people employed and taking and allowing them to feed their families, not just for the owners, but for the employees. And you got to fight for the company. So that there are going to be times when there's so much at stake for either side that taking a hard line for as long as possible is going to be justified. That's usually not the case. Usually in commercial cases where people's life and liberty isn't a threat, which is most of the cases that we're involved in. There's a reasonable solution that can be achieved, but there are some cases even on the commercial side where you're going to hold out for a long time because a matter of principle is at stake, and either the survival of the company or the vindication of a really important right is at stake, and you've got to fight for it.
Robert, let's talk about negotiating with bad people. You've negotiated hostage release. I would characterize somebody who takes a hostage and threatens to kill them as a bad person. And I think that goes beyond just a person behaving badly under the circumstances. Am I right in this characterization? And how do you negotiate with really bad people?
Yeah, so if everyone were angels, we wouldn't have to negotiate, right? So we don't. At least the lawyers among us would be out of work, and the mediators probably would be as well. So, I dealt with North Koreans, I dealt with the Iranians, I dealt with the Russians, the Chinese. I mean, I dealt with people. I sat in the room with literally people that were killers and killed other people in egregious fashion. I've got a fatwa against me from the Iranians. I've been sanctioned by the Chinese. I still require security. So it's unfortunately, when you do the type of work I did as either the hostage envoy or the national security advisor, you're not dealing with angels. Fortunately, I had the chance to spend some time negotiating at the Vatican, and they're great negotiators, but it's, no one at the Vatican is going to kill you, but your choice is to go, you don't get to just choose to negotiate with the Swiss and with the pontiff. So you have to negotiate with the bad folks as well, because they're the ones that took the hostages. They're the ones that are engaged in the war, the unprovoked war, if it's the Russians against Ukraine. And you've got to put aside the personal distaste for them and try and look at in my case, most of the times it was diplomats. There were some pretty nasty folks that I had to parlay with, but for the most part, they're diplomats, and you try and develop a relationship with them, a cordial relationship, a professional relationship. You try and find out, again, if they have family, if they have kids, and develop some commonality, knowing that they represent the Syrian regime or the Iranian regime, or folks that are the Russians that are killers, that are putting people in jail, political prisoners in jail, and arresting journalists and killing their own people. The Chinese were engaged in genocide when I was dealing with them, with their Uyghur population, with Tibet, extinguishing democracy in Hong Kong. But we realized, it's a dangerous world out there, and there were things that America needed from them. We needed to get people home, in the case of detainees or hostages, and or we needed to at least come up with some kind of accord, so we didn't turn a dispute into a hot war where we lost our sons and daughters at war and had to go to had to bring them home in caskets. And so there are things important enough to negotiate with bad people, and we're gonna see it in the commercial sense, probably not some of the killers that I had to deal with, but you're gonna have people that are unsavory business people, unethical business people, fraudsters. And you got to understand what your role is. Why you're not there to right every wrong in the world. You're not there to be an avenging angel. You're there to get a case resolved. Or in my case, you were there to get a hostage home, and we had to keep that goal in mind, and try and separate your personal distaste for either the person you're on the other side of the counterparty, or the lawyer, or the ultimate company, or whoever it is that's on the other side of it, that's engaged in the bad conduct, and try and get the deal that you've been tasked with resolving done. And realize you're not going to be able to right every wrong, but you can make a small difference by bringing a hostage home to their family, or by getting a ceasefire in place that'll save lives. And but it's not always easy. And it's not always easy to shake hands and smile with someone who's, not just not a good person, but someone who's, engaged in a genocide or a real terrible activity.
I imagine sometimes you've had to bite your tongue so hard you made it bleed.
Yeah.
Robert, I know you spend a lot of time thinking about China. You've mentioned China a couple times in this talk. If you were advising the United States government on national security affairs today and how to negotiate with China, what would be your advice?
Well, the first thing I'll tell you, Jeff, is I was much smarter on national security issues and negotiation, all that sort of thing before I was national security advisor. And then I've become much smarter again after I've left office. It's amazing how all the wisdom has come back to me. But when you're there in the middle of it, muddling through, it's a little tougher. And that's why I try to keep a tradition up that my predecessors engaged in, which was plenty of people criticized me. Don't get me wrong, but I was never criticized by my predecessors, either Republican or Democrat, because they know how tough the position is. And I'm always a little reticent to give advice, but that won't entirely stop me. I still go on TV from time to time. And I think one of the nice things that has come out of the last administration to this administration, one of the areas of continuities on China, I think we now have a bipartisan consensus, and you're seeing this with the Chinese committee, the committee on that Mike Gallagher is chairing in the House. I think it's not the Committee on China, it's actually the Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. And there are just a number of things we have to do. We have to understand the Chinese are hardworking, they're smart, they're relentless. They've got a plan to not just to take Taiwan, but to dominate the globe. They're active across all sectors. I mean, they're buying. We saw the spy balloon, and we saw how bad that was. Total invasion of our sovereignty, and blatant disregard for what how we'd react. We see them buying farmland next to our bases. We see TikTok, sucking up data and spying on everybody in America, while at the same time they don't allow Facebook or Google or Twitter in their country. We see a massive military buildup, the likes of which we haven't seen since the Kaiser tried to build up the Kriegsmarine before the First World War. We see the Belts and Roads program, which is a Chinese aid program, but it's really a bribery and corruption scheme that's impoverishing countries around the world and making them vassals and dependents of the Chinese, while enriching their leaders, who the Chinese are paying off in bribes in places like Switzerland and the Caymans. They're just a myriad of challenges that we face with the China relationship. I mean, we watch they're in hot combat with the Indians and killing Indian soldiers on the line of actual control. They're taking Philippine islands just because they can. The Philippines don't have the ability to defend themselves or defend their territory. We saw the democracy extinguished in Hong Kong. Tibet is what used to be a popular issue in America, and people rallied around the Dalai Lama. That's kind of a forgotten issue, but there's been a genocide in Tibet. There's a terrible genocide going on against the Muslim population in Western China. So the Chinese are bad actors. I'm not suggesting we have war with the Chinese. We don't want war. We want peace with China. We don't want war with China. But we're going to have to be strong. We're going to have to rebuild the military. We're going to have to confront them. We're going to have to stop their intellectual property theft. We're going to have to confront their espionage in the U.S. We're going to have to stand up for our friends in Taiwan. I was just in Taiwan for a week, and people in Taiwan are wonderful people. They've got a vibrant democracy. It's one of the democratic success stories of the last 40 years of our lifetime, watching them go from an authoritarian country to a full democracy with a great female president, Tsai Ing-wen, who was just here in the U.S. last week. And the Chinese are threatening to wipe out the democracy for no other reason than it's a threat to China. It shows that Chinese people can govern themselves in a vibrant democracy, and they don't need the Communist Party to have the boot on the neck of the people of China. So the Chinese are exerting threats, exerting influence, and creating threats all across the region and the world, and we need to stand up to them, and we can. But we've got to do it not just with America, with our allies. And that's why President Macron's statements were a little disappointing. I mean, the French always want their independence, and I'm a Francophile myself, but his comments coming back from China weren't helpful last week. And we've got to rally the West. We saw what happened to Ukraine when we didn't do enough to support Ukraine prior to the Russian invasion. We need to make sure that does not happen with Taiwan, and we need to to rally the West and rally the free world. That means India, that means Indonesia, that means Malaysia, that means Brazil. And that's going to take a lot of hard work and a lot of hard diplomacy on our part.
Fair enough. The issue of building alliances and peace through strength, themes that you've spoken about many, many times throughout your career. Robert, let me ask you, you mentioned President Trump, and everybody knows you worked for him. That's kind of the elephant in the room in many senses. I'm not going to ask you about any politically charged topics, but rather some personal things. Before President Trump went into politics, he was pretty famous as a negotiator. He wrote The Art of the Deal and other books like that. Can you comment on his negotiation style and what you thought of President Trump's negotiation style?
Yeah, so I didn't know President Trump until I became his hostage envoy. I'd been with other candidates in the prior election. I didn't say anything negative about President Trump, or I wouldn't have been hired. I'm sure it would have been the case, but I didn't know him well. I got to know him very well during the time I worked with him. And in some ways, he made my life very easy as a negotiator, because both as a hostage envoy and as national security advisor, I could kind of come and say, hey, look, I can play the good cop every time, and you can make a deal with me and we'll be reasonable and we'll get a good deal, or I can just wash my hands of it and you can see what President Trump ends up doing, and good luck. I remember a hostage negotiation that I'd flown back to LA for the weekend where my home is. And we thought we were getting a hostage out on a Saturday, and we had a plane go down. A former congressman was going to escort the person home. The deal kind of went south, and the plane was stopped on the tarmac, and the person was taken off the plane. And I got a frantic call, and I was in the office I'm in right now. I'm at my home, and I picked up the phone and called the ambassador for the other country and said, hey, I don't know what the ethical rules are in your country, but if you can sell everything in every stock you hold in your current stock market holdings in your retirement account or your personal holdings, I'd sell them today if you can. Now, maybe ethically you can't do that because you're now acting on inside information. But I said I can only imagine. And I just went on Wikipedia quickly and saw what their biggest exports were. I said, I'm sure that you're going to get a massive tariff on Monday since this deal went sideways, and the president's waiting for me to call him and tell him that this guy is in the air. I can only imagine what he's going to do. And my guess is he's going to sanction film like X. And that's going to probably cause a 10 or 15% drop in your stock market on Monday. But you've been a great guy. I know this isn't your fault. I know you don't agree with this, but this hostage has been pulled off the plane. So I'm just giving you a heads up. You really ought to liquidate all your holdings and save some money if you can do that ethically. I said, hold on. He called. And we got our guy back on the plane, and he was on the plane and he flew home. I called him back. I said, great job, Ambassador. Thank you. And we got it done. So another example is NATO funding. President Trump got a lot of flack and probably phrased things differently than I would have, but he was president, I wasn't. But we talked when we were dealing with NATO in 2019. We really needed to get the European countries to pay their fair share, because we knew what a challenge Russia was going to be and what a challenge China would be. And it wasn't fair that the American taxpayers were paying for the defense of Europe. We needed the NATO countries had committed to paying 2%. Very few of them were doing it. I think only 4 countries. And President Trump went on TV and said, look, these are guys like at the club who aren't paying their dues. And if you don't pay your dues at the club, you can't play golf, or you get suspended from the club. And we're going to have to do that with NATO. And there was a hue and cry, and people went nuts over it, or destroyed the Atlantic Alliance. We're going to destroy NATO and the whole thing. And my interlocutor at NATO is the current Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, who's one of the great statesmen in the world. He's just done a terrific job on the Ukraine, holding the alliance together on Ukraine, and very good man. And he and I got to be great friends, and we both agreed with President Trump that the NATO countries had to increase their spending, but we had to get them there. And so, when Jens and I were walking around, so to speak, the hallways of the European capitals with our tin cup, looking for contributions, it made it a lot easier to get those contributions when you had Donald Trump, taking a very hardline position publicly on what the U.S. would or wouldn't do with NATO if the NATO countries didn't, pay their fair share. We got to the summit, and the NATO countries agreed to spend $400 billion in new spending over 10 years. It was the biggest increase and that was non-North American spending, biggest increase ever. And a lot of that money indirectly has now gone to Ukraine, because some of the arms that were bought over the last 4 years as a result of that summit allowed the European countries to give their older arms, their old Soviet weapons, in many cases, to the Ukrainians. And so it had a real world impact. But it was an unorthodox style. It was a little jarring for those of us who were, are big, supporters of the Atlantic Alliance. It was hard to hear, but it eventually got us to where we needed to be. And I've had Europeans now, including Germans, who hated it, were not happy with us at the time, have now come. I went to a defense conference in Prague recently, and the Germans all lined up and said, "You were right, we were wrong, and thank you for playing hardball with us." So again, President Trump was unorthodox in many ways, but we got some good results as a result of or as a consequence of some of his unorthodox negotiating style.
And last question I'll ask you, Robert, is about your work in Afghanistan. I'm sure a lot of it had to do with standing up for the rights of women in Afghanistan. Could you comment on that work briefly and some of the results you've achieved there?
Yeah, it's a very hard thing to talk about now because I put in a lot of time. I was actually a holdover from the Bush administration into the Obama administration, so I never really advertised that when I was in the Trump administration, but I actually worked in the Obama administration for Secretary Clinton for a year because it was such an important bipartisan job to try and fix the justice system in Afghanistan. And part of what Secretary Rice felt and what Secretary Clinton felt, and that's why I think why she kept me on, is that one of the ways to fix the justice system was to get more women involved as prosecutors and as judges and as defense lawyers. And so we spent a lot of time. We brought a lot of Afghan women here to America to train them with a lot of our great judges and female lawyers and female judges here. I think Christine Durham, who's the Chief Justice of the Utah Supreme Court, who got involved, and others here like Connie Marshall and Margaret Moreau and others who helped these women. Sandra Day O'Connor was very committed to it, the mission, and most of those women, well, all the judges are now out of work, unfortunately. A lot of the women who'd been educated post 9/11 can't send their girls to school now. So it's a tragedy. It's tough for us as Americans, and it was a terrible catastrophe the way that withdrawal was done. But the real devastation and damage is to the people in Afghanistan, and especially the Afghan women. They're slowly but surely being subjugated again, and having to sneak into basements for, I mean, can you imagine being a dad or a mom and having to take your daughter to the basement of a home and have her surreptitiously learn to read and write? I mean, that's what's happening again. And it's I've got two daughters, and it's heartbreaking, and we're gonna have to hope for the best in Afghanistan. It's probably a little bit better than it was in the last Taliban regime, but it's still a bad situation.
Robert, there's no end to the work that needs to be done to repair the world. I'm sure everyone who's listened to this presentation is very happy to know that you're one of the people who's on the job. So thank you very much for your service to our country.
My wife always gets mad at me and says I'm a Debbie Downer on these calls, and but look, there's a lot of hope. We've got a great country. There's a lot of freedom's going to prevail in the end. It always does, but it takes a lot of hard work. But we need to have hope, and we need to have, and look, I think this applies in our mediation practices domestically as well, and our arbitration practices. We've got to have hope and confidence in the future and faith that things will work out. But it doesn't mean that in the battle of good versus evil, you're going to have to roll up your sleeves and put in a hard effort. But I don't want people to be depressed by all the good news I've had to share with you today.
Okay, well, I guess it's time for everybody to get back to work, all of us, on improving our world in whatever way we can in our own domains. Robert, it's a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. We hope that people are able to contribute to the Los Angeles Regional Food Bank if you live here in Los Angeles, or another food bank in whatever community, wherever you live. Please let us know, let Jean or me or Natalie know so we can add it to our running total. Ambassador O'Brien, this was quite a morning. Thank you very much. And
thanks, Jeff. God bless you, and thanks everyone for participating.
And with that, we are complete.